On the 9th of June 1816, the Observer newspaper ran a very interesting obituary on a woman named Jane Lewson. The piece explained how she passed away at her house in London 2 weeks earlier on the 28th of May at the ripe old age of 116. Apparently she survived for so long owing to some bizarre habits. So what were these? And was she really that old? Join me as we explore her strange life story. Jane Vaughan, known as Jane Lewson, was supposedly born in the year 1700 in Essex Street, London, though no birth certificate has ever been uncovered to verify this. This may instantly put doubts in your mind about her birth, but it should be noted that few baptismal records from the early 1700s have fully survived. She was said to have been born into a respectable family, so her parents were possibly professionals or merchants. Although nothing is really known about Jane's early life, we can assume she had a typical upbringing for someone of her social class. She was likely raised in a large household with servants and led a relatively comfortable life. Jane's education would have focused on the domestic arts, such as sewing, cooking and housekeeping, as well as on religious instruction. She also would have been required to learn how to dance, play music and paint. Once Jane reached a marriageable age, she was expected to marry well, and it seems like she did. It does appear that Jane Vaughan, her maiden name, married a certain Mr. Lewson, a London merchant in 1726 in London. They subsequently had a daughter together, following which Mr. Lewson died prematurely, leaving his wife to raise her alone. Thus, this marriage record would certainly seem to indicate that she was born very early in the 18th century. Not much is known about Lewson's life in the years immediately after her husband's death. Being a wealthy widow, it's said that she had many suitors, but never remarried. We also don't know the manner in which she raised her daughter, but it was likely similar to her upbringing, largely being defined by her future role as a wife and mother. In time, her daughter married and moved away, and after this, Jane became a very eccentric figure. From the 1780s or so onwards, Lewson was increasingly noted for her old age across London and then England. She was celebrated for her longevity, and people became very interested in her lifestyle, but as you will see, it is very different from what anyone would have imagined. Lewson was known to be a peculiar individual during her old age and then during her ancient age. For one, she was a retiring character who hardly ever left her house and would also rarely permit anyone to visit her in her own home. This would suggest she spent several decades with little contact with the rest of the world. There were some exceptions though. For example, she had an old female servant who visited her to carry out some household chores between the late 1780s and 1806. However, even she eventually died, and Lewson briefly hired others to fill this role, but none were to her liking. Apart from 2 old lapdogs and a cat, her only companion was an elderly man who maintained several properties in the area. Initially, he helped Lewson with various errands, but since he proved very useful, she eventually took him into her home, where he served as her steward, butler, cook and housekeeper. Sadly, by now it seems like she had no contact with her family, her nearest relatives having died long before. Lewson's house was described as a large abode, one which had once been a fine, elegantly furnished London home, but which had inevitably declined over the decades. The eccentric Lady Lewson insisted in keeping the beds in the spare rooms freshly made up, though no one had slept in these for years. This contrasted with her housekeeping elsewhere. She refused to have the windows washed, fearing they could break and let germs in, and as the decades passed, dirt and dust began to cover them, preventing natural light from entering the house. Besides her grimy windows and decaying interior, we know that Lewson did enjoy maintaining her garden, and neighbours reminisced about how in the summer months she would often sit there and read for hours. Occasionally she would visit others, and was known to talk to the local grocer in the square and visit 1 or 2 old acquaintances. Yet, as was unavoidable, Lewson went on to outlive everyone she had known as a younger and middle-aged woman, her daughter included. In her obituary, the Observer made keen note of her retro dress sense, noting that, quote, "She was so partial to the fashions that prevailed in her youthful days that she never changed the manner of her dress from that worn in the reign of George I. She always wore powder with a large tate, made of horsehair on her head, near half a foot high, over which her hair was turned up, a cap over it which knotted under her chin, and 3 or 4 curls hanging down her neck. She generally wore silk gowns and the train long, with a deep flounce all around, a very long waist, and very tightly laced up to her neck, round which was a kind of ruff or frill. The sleeves of her gown came below the elbow, from each of which 4 or 5 cuffs were attached, a large straw bonnet quite flat, high-heeled shoes, a large black silk coat, trimmed around the lace, and a gold-headed cane completed her everyday costume for the last 80 years, and in which she walked round the square, on which account she was known by the name of Lady Lewson. Something that her contemporaries were very eager to hear about was her health, and how she had lived for so long. Apparently, there was no secret to Lewson's longevity, other than superstition. Lewson was convinced that washing would give her a cold, so she never washed. Instead, she coated herself in hog's lard because it was soft and smooth. Also, she was said to have insisted on drinking her tea out of her favourite cup, while she would only eat while sitting in her favourite chair and with her cutlery arranged in a very specific pattern. Otherwise, she was generally averse to medicine and doctors. It was claimed that she had a remarkable dental history, having never lost any teeth, but bizarrely having sprouted 2 new ones in 1787, as she neared her 90th year. This might not be an entirely fantastical statement. Hypodontia, where an individual begins to grow additional teeth beyond the normal set in their adult years, is more common than one would think, and occurs in over 3.5% of people today. However, the possibility that Jane Lewson could have suddenly developed extra teeth at 87 years of age is a bit far-fetched. More believable was the acknowledgement that her sight had begun to fail her in her later years. By the time she reached her 110s, Jane Lewson was acknowledged by many to be the most knowledgeable source on English history in London, simply because she had lived through so many events and still had a sharp memory of them. She was, so it was claimed, able to recall events as far back as 1715, meaning that she was able to trace details of the Jacobite uprisings in Scotland in the first half of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War with France between 1756 and 1763, and the American War of Independence in the 1770s, while also having lived through the entirety of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1793 and 1815. Lewson was evidently and understandably superstitious about her possible death by the mid-1810s. In the middle of May 1816, an old lady who lived down the street from her died suddenly, an event which caused Lewson to predict that her own time was close at hand, and so it proved. Lewson died at home on the 28th of May 1816, supposedly aged 116. She was subsequently buried in Bunhill Fields burying ground in the English capital, with a funeral hearse and mourning carriages to provide for the solemn occasion of the death of one of England's longest-lived women in history. After her passing, it appears as though Lewson didn't want anyone entering her home. Well, one witness who visited Jane's house around this time reported being shocked upon entry. He spotted numerous bolts and bars fitted to the doors and windows, and the ceiling of the upper floors was also lined with bars, as if to prevent anyone from entering the property through the ceiling. He also noted that the cinder ashes had not been removed for years, and were piled up so high that they looked like beds. Not long after her death, Lewson essentially became known countrywide owing to an obituary ran by the Observer newspaper on the 9th of June 1816 entitled A Singular Character. The piece explains how one of England's middling celebrities had passed away at her house at number 12 Coldbath Square near Clerkenwell and Farringdon in London 2 weeks earlier. Readers of the paper were fascinated to learn that this woman was born during the reign of King William III, and that her life had run through the reigns of 5 British monarchs, including that of King George III, who, having ruled between 1760 and 1820, was England's longest reigning king in history at that point. Yet, owing to her shadowy birth record, can we really be sure that she lived to 116? And was this even possible by the standards of the time? If Jane Lewson really was 116 years of age at the time of her passing, the next question which arises is, how common was it for people to live beyond 100 years of age in early modern times? After all, the period between 1500 and 1800 was one of strikingly lower life expectancies than today. While most individuals can hope to live into the second half of their 70s or early 80s in modern times, in the 17th and 18th centuries, life expectancy was about 37 years of age. And yet, Jane Lewson's momentous age was not entirely out of place. Life expectancies were so low at this time owing to the rate of infant and child mortality, with about 40% of all children dying before they reached 10 years of age. On top of this, diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis and the bubonic plague were deadly at the time and further reduced life expectancy levels. However, if you managed to avoid dying in infancy or childhood and dodge the many bullets which diseases like smallpox threw at you during your lifetime, a person could still expect to live to a very old age. Indeed, for some like Jane Lewson, she would have benefited in old age from 18th century's lack of distinctly modern problems like obesity, heart disease and diabetes. As such, it is plausible that Jane Lewson did live to 116 years of age. Nevertheless, a recent investigation into her life has discovered clues and records which indicate that Jane Lewson was much younger than what we previously believed. According to a burial record from Bunhill Fields, Jane was actually 96 years of age when she passed, meaning she was born around the year 1720. Also, the record spells her surname Lewson L-U-S, not L-E-W, as she is typically known. Furthermore, a marriage record from July 1751 notes a Jane Vaughan marrying Robert Lewson at St Mary le Strand, Somerset House Chapel. Robert Lewson was a very wealthy merchant, and the couple is registered as having had 3 daughters and a son. Then, in 1769, nearly 20 years after their marriage, Robert passed away, and left his estate Blunsdon Hall to his eldest daughter Maria, though Jane was looked after. Aside from these key details, it appears as though the rest of her story is the same, though certain aspects of her character may have been exaggerated. As with much of her life, there is debate as to who the beneficiaries of her will were. Some sources claim she left half her estate to the executor of the will and watchmaker William Anthony, and half to members of the Huskinson family, though others state it was her servant and an old friend who received most of her estate, with nothing going to her extended family members who were still alive. Many people have probably come across elements of Jane Lewson's story without realising it. She is believed to have been the influence for Charles Dickens when he came to creating the character of Miss Havisham in one of his most acclaimed novels, Great Expectations, published in 1861. Havisham's character is a wealthy spinster who was abandoned by her would-be husband on their wedding day. She subsequently lives in a darkened mansion permanently dressed in her wedding gown and prematurely aging owing to her lack of contact with sunlight. Given Lewson's propensity for wearing ancient dresses, the darkness her home was shrouded in, and her age, it has been conjectured that Dickens derived some of the concepts for Havisham's character from Lady Lewson's life story. This aside, there are numerous other figures who Dickens is said to have been inspired by in his creation of Miss Havisham's character, notably Eliza Emily Donnithorne, a woman who lived in Sydney, Australia in the 1840s, at which time her husband-to-be left her on their wedding day. Donnithorne allegedly spent the next 20 years of her life confined to her house wearing her wedding dress, and with the decayed remains of what would have been her wedding cake on the table. All told, Jane Lewson's story is a happier inspiration for Miss Havisham, the alleged 116-year-old woman who lived across the entirety of the 18th century. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on Jane Lewson. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and let me know down below in the comments if you think she lived to 116 or if she was only 96. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.